The earth beneath my fingernails was a comfort. It was honest. You give it care. You respect its nature, and it gives you life. That was the bargain. A simple and profound contract I had come to prefer over any human-made agreement. My front yard, to the casual observer, might have looked like a chaotic mess. To me, it was a symphony. A carefully curated expanse of native grasses, little bluestem, and prairie dropseed that swayed in the breeze like a green ocean. Islands of vibrant color burst forth the fiery orange of butterfly weed, the regal purple of coneflowers, the cheerful yellow of black-eyed Susans. This wasn't a lawn. It was a habitat, a living memorial to my late wife, Clara, a botanist who believed that a patch of land should serve the earth it occupied, not just the vanity of its owner. Here in Serenity Creek, a name dripping with an irony so thick you could taste it, my yard was an act of quiet rebellion. The surrounding properties were monuments to sterility perfect, chemically green carpets of fescue, trimmed to a uniform and unyielding height. They were silent, lifeless expanses, demanding constant tribute in water, fertilizer, and gasoline. My yard hummed with the sound of bees, buzzed with the flutter of swallowtails, and sang with the chirps of goldfinches feasting on seedheads. It was everything I wanted in my retirement, a small, thriving ecosystem, where I could feel connected to something real after a lifetime spent navigating the sterile corridors of law and policy. I had been in the house for 2 months, and the garden was just beginning to hit its summer stride when the inevitable visit occurred. A shadow fell over the patch of milkweed I was inspecting for monarch caterpillars. I looked up into the face of a woman who seemed to have been sculpted from hardened certainty. Her blonde hair was sprayed into a motionless helmet, her face a mask of pleasant but firm disapproval. She wore a blindingly white polo shirt with the Serenity Creek logo, a weeping willow that looked more like a melted candle embroidered on the chest. She held a clipboard like a scepter. "Elias Vance," she asked, her voice as crisp as a freshly ironed pleat. "Eli, please," I said, rising to my feet and wiping the soil from my hands onto my jeans. I offered a smile. "And you are?" "Brenda Milcroft. I'm the president of the Serenity Creek Homeowners Association." She didn't smile back. Her gaze was fixed on my garden, and it was the look of a health inspector discovering a rat in a 5-star kitchen. "I'm here to personally welcome you to the neighborhood and to discuss your landscaping." "Ah, yes. It's coming along nicely. Don't you think the pollinators are certainly enjoying it?" I gestured to a fat bumblebee tumbling drunkenly out of a coneflower. "Mr. Vance," she said, her tone shifting from formal to prosecutorial. "Article 9, Section B of the CC&Rs is quite clear. All front-facing yards must be seeded with an approved turf grass species and maintained at a height not to exceed 4 inches. What you have here, this is not turf grass. No, it's a native pollinator garden. It's xeriscaped, so it uses a fraction of the water of a traditional lawn. It supports the local ecosystem. I assure you, none of these are noxious weeds. They're all indigenous perennials. I was trying to be educational, neighborly. It was a tactical error." Brenda Milcroft was not interested in education. "It looks messy," she declared, the final, irrefutable judgment of her court. "It looks like a vacant lot. It brings down the aesthetic value of the entire community. Our property values are predicated on a neat, uniform appearance. Your habitat is a violation." She made a sharp, decisive checkmark on a sheet on her clipboard. "You'll be receiving a formal notice to cure. You have 14 days to clear this and install sod. If you fail to comply, fines will be assessed." I felt a familiar, weary tightening in my chest. For 40 years, I had dealt with people like Brenda, people who mistook their narrow preferences for universal law, who wielded petty regulations like weapons of mass destruction. I had advised governors and attorneys general on complex environmental statutes, drafted legislation that balanced the needs of industry and nature, and argued cases before commissions who held the fate of entire watersheds in their hands. And now, my final battle was to be fought over Clara's coneflowers with a woman armed with a clipboard. "Brenda," I said, my voice losing its friendly edge, becoming calmer, more measured. "Perhaps you're not aware, but state and county ordinances actively encourage water-wise landscaping like this. In some jurisdictions, HOA covenants that prohibit them are legally unenforceable." A flicker of something surprise, annoyance crossed her face. It was the look of a queen whose divine right had just been questioned by a peasant. "We have our own rules here, Mr. Vance, and I suggest you follow them. Welcome to Serenity Creek." She turned, her white sneakers pristine, and marched back toward the sidewalk, leaving me standing in my vibrant, living, and now officially illegal, garden. The bees continued their work, oblivious to the declaration of war that had just been issued. But I was not. The lines had been drawn, not in the rich soil at my feet, but in the unyielding ink of Brenda Milcroft's rulebook. The first formal notice arrived 2 days later, delivered by a certified letter that felt comically oversized for its petty contents. It was a cold, impersonal document, citing Article 9, Section B, and demanding the complete removal of my unapproved vegetation and its replacement with sod. The fine for non-compliance was listed as $100 per day, to commence in 14 days. It was signed, in a sharp, aggressive script, Brenda Milcroft, President, SCHOA. My first instinct, born of 4 decades of legal practice, was to craft a devastatingly precise and legally unassailable response. I could cite the State Water Conservation Act of 2009, reference the county's own greenscaping initiatives, and politely imply that their covenant was a lawsuit waiting to happen. But that was the old Elias. The new Elias, the retiree, the quiet gardener, simply wanted peace. A full-scale legal battle was the antithesis of the life I was trying to build. So, I chose a path of conciliation. I would try to reason with her. I typed up a calm, respectful letter. I explained the ecological and financial benefits of my garden once more. I included printouts from the University Extension Service, highlighting the importance of pollinator habitats. As a compromise, I offered to install a neat, low border of river stones around the entire garden bed to give it a more defined, intentional look, and I promised to diligently remove any plants that might stray into the small strip of turf that bordered the sidewalk. I was extending an olive branch, trying to demonstrate that I was a reasonable man willing to meet her halfway. I mailed it to the HOA's P.O. box and waited. The response came a week later. It was not a letter. It was another violation notice. This one was for $250. The reason listed, failure to address violation, 2025, A17, landscaping and submitting unsolicited and non-compliant correspondence. She had fined me for writing to her. The sheer, breathtaking arrogance of it almost made me laugh. Almost. Instead, a cold resolve began to settle in my bones. Conciliation had failed. The olive branch had been snapped in two and thrown back in my face. This was no longer a misunderstanding. This was a campaign. Every morning, I would wake up to a new white envelope taped to my door, a fine for noxious weeds, with a blurry photo of a perfectly healthy black-eyed Susan attached as evidence, a fine for my prairie dropseed grass exceeding the 4-inch height limit, a rule clearly intended for turf grass and nonsensically applied to a native ornamental grass that could grow to be 3 feet tall. She was twisting the language of the bylaws into a pretzel to justify her harassment. It was then that the strategist in me, the man I had tried to put into permanent retirement, began to stir. I went to my office, a room filled with boxes of legal texts I had intended to leave unpacked, and retrieved a single, pristine legal ledger. I opened it to the first page and wrote, "In Re Serenity Creek, HOA v. Vance." I created a case file. Every notice, every letter, every photograph was dated, cataloged, and cross-referenced. I began a meticulous log, documenting every interaction, every new fine. My internal monologue started to shift. Thoughts like, "This establishes a clear pattern of harassment, and her deliberate misinterpretation of the covenant's language shows malice," began to bubble up. The quiet gardener was receding, and the senior counsel was taking notes. I was still attempting to comply on the surface. I did install the stone border I had offered, a silent testament to my initial, good faith attempt at compromise. But I was also preparing for a war I now knew was unavoidable. Brenda Millcroft thought she was dealing with a retired hippie with a green thumb. She had no idea she was methodically building a case against herself, and that the man she was targeting had spent his entire career prosecuting bullies just like her. The conflict, as I knew it would, seeped from the mailbox into the garden itself. It happened on a blistering August morning. I was having my coffee on the back porch when a strange, acrid smell, like a chemical solvent, drifted on the breeze. It was out of place among the sweet scent of the phlox and the earthy smell of the soil. I walked around to the front yard, a knot of dread tightening in my stomach. There, in the heart of the garden, was a patch of death, a perfect circle, about 6 feet in diameter, of my prized butterfly weed, and swamp milkweed was wilted, yellowed, and dying. The leaves were curled and scorched as if by a terrible poison, and the soil around them was dark and oily. The chemical smell was overpowering. Someone had come in the night and deliberately doused Clara's favorite section of the garden, the part specifically cultivated for the monarch butterflies she had so loved to study, with a potent herbicide. Rage, cold and pure, washed over me. This was different from the paper-based warfare of fines and notices. This was a physical violation, a desecration. It was a message, delivered with the subtlety of a sledgehammer. I can reach into your life and kill what you love. The act was, of course, designed to be deniable. There were no footprints on the dry ground, no witnesses in the dead of night. It could be blamed on a careless lawn care company spraying a neighbor's yard on a windy day, or some unknown pestilence. But the precision of it, the targeting of the very plants that looked the most weedy to an untrained eye, told me everything I needed to know. This was Brenda's work. Whether she held the sprayer herself or had one of her loyal board members do it was immaterial. The order had come from the top. That afternoon, I made a trip to a commercial security supply store, bypassing the consumer-grade options at the big-box retailers. I walked out with 4 high-resolution, weatherproof cameras with night vision capabilities, a networked video recorder, and enough shielded cable to wire a bank. The skills I'd acquired over the years weren't limited to the courtroom. I'd done site security assessments for sensitive state facilities, and I knew what to look for. I spent the next 2 days in the sweltering heat, carefully concealing the cameras under the eaves of the house and inside a hollowed-out birdhouse. I configured the system to record on motion detection, creating specific zones of interest and setting the sensitivity to ignore the swaying of plants, but to capture anything larger than a raccoon. The server was in my locked office, the data encrypted. My internal monologue was all about evidentiary procedure. Maintain a clear chain of custody for the footage. Do not alter the original files. Log all access. My home was no longer just a sanctuary. It was a secure facility. As I worked, I thought about the legal principles at play. This wasn't just vandalism. This was trespass to chattels, the legal term for intentionally interfering with another person's lawful possession of a personal property. In this state, cultivated plants were considered chattels. The act was also a potential violation of the state's environmental protection laws regarding the unauthorized application of specific herbicides. I found myself mentally drafting the complaint, listing the causes of action, calculating the potential damages, both compensatory and punitive. The gardener was mourning his dead plants, but the lawyer in me was gathering the evidence needed to make the perpetrator pay for their crime. I felt a grim sense of purpose. Brenda had escalated the conflict to a new, more serious level. And in doing so, she had given me the opening I needed to escalate my response in kind. Brenda's next front in her war of attrition was an attack on my character. Since direct assault on my garden had been met with a silent, stony resilience, she turned to the tool of every modern tyrant, the dissemination of propaganda. The official organ for this was the Serenity Creek Monthly Sentinel, the HOA's newsletter, a glossy, self-important publication that Brenda wrote and edited herself. The September issue arrived in my mailbox, and, on the front page, under a smiling photo of Brenda herself, was an article titled, "Protecting Our Paradise Community: Vigilance and Property Values." It was a masterpiece of innuendo. Without ever mentioning my name, it painted a terrifying picture of the dangers posed by irresponsible and unmanaged landscapes. She wrote of the increased risk of vermin, including rats and snakes, drawn to the overgrown, weed-like conditions of certain properties. She mentioned the potential for noxious pollens to aggravate allergies, and the fire hazard posed by dead, brushy growth. Every phrase was a poisoned dart aimed directly at my native garden. She was framing my ecosystem as a plague house, a threat to the health and safety of the entire neighborhood. The effect was almost instantaneous. Serenity Creek, which had never been particularly friendly, became openly hostile. My immediate neighbors, the Hendersons, who had at least offered a polite nod before, now herded their children inside if they saw me in my yard. I overheard Mrs. Henderson telling her son, "Don't go near that messy yard. Sweetie, you might get bitten by a snake." Another neighbor, from across the street, stopped me as I was getting my mail. "You really should do something about that situation," he said, gesturing vaguely at my thriving garden. "Brenda's right. It's a health hazard." I was being systematically isolated, turned into the neighborhood bogeyman. The slander was working. The sense of community, already fragile, was being weaponized against me, creating a wall of suspicion and fear. The peace and quiet I had sought in retirement felt like a distant, naive dream. My home, my sanctuary, was now the subject of fear-mongering and gossip. It was during this period of intense isolation that I received a call from an old and dear friend. The caller ID simply read, "Robert." "Eli, you old son of a gun." A warm, authoritative voice boomed through the phone. "Don't tell me you're actually enjoying retirement." "Robert, it's good to hear your voice," I said, a genuine smile touching my lips for the first time in weeks. "And I would be, if it weren't for some local political entanglements." Robert Thorne, the current Attorney General for the state of Virginia, let out a hearty laugh. I had been his chief policy advisor for a decade before he won the AG election, and we'd remained close friends. We had fought countless battles together in the political and legal arenas. Local politics. Huh, he said. Let me guess. You've discovered that the town's zoning ordinance violates a pre-Civil War water rights treaty, and you're threatening to bankrupt them. Or have you found a rare, endangered salamander in the mayor's prize-winning petunias? Something like that. I said, the irony thick in my voice. It involves an HOA and a dispute over native plants. An HOA. Robert roared with laughter. Eli, you've gone from taking on multinational corporations over illegal dumping to fighting with the garden club. My God, how the mighty have fallen. Look, the real reason I'm calling is that I'm heading up to my cabin on Lake Anna for a long weekend to get away from this legislative session. I was hoping you'd join me. We could do some fishing, crack open that bottle of scotch you gave me, and you can tell me all about your war with the Petunia police. I have a feeling I'm going to need your ear. Robert, I said, looking out the window at my beautiful, maligned garden, and maybe some unofficial legal advice. For you, Eli, anything, he said, his voice turning serious for a moment. Just try not to have the whole place condemned before I get there. We hung up, and I felt a profound sense of relief. The call had been a lifeline. Brenda thought she was isolating me, cutting me off from the community. She didn't understand that my community wasn't defined by the manicured lawns of Serenity Creek. My connections ran deeper, into the very halls of power she so desperately and clumsily tried to emulate. She was slandering me in a newsletter. I was on a first-name basis with the chief law enforcement officer of the state. The thought was a comfort, a hidden ace I had yet to play. Her campaign of social isolation was having the opposite effect she intended. It was pushing me to reconnect with a world she couldn't possibly imagine, a world where her petty tyranny would be seen for exactly what it was. Brenda's crusade to eradicate my garden, and, by extension, my presence in her pristine kingdom, soon escalated from slander to the weaponization of public agencies. Having failed to intimidate me with her own limited authority, she began to leverage the power of the county and state, weaving a narrative of public nuisance that she hoped would force the government to do her dirty work for her. The first official vehicle to arrive was a large, mud-splattered truck from the Fairfax County Weed Abatement Board. Two men in county uniforms got out, looking grimly determined, holding clipboards of their own. Brenda was watching from her front window, a triumphant smirk visible even from across the street. Elias Vance, the older of the two men, asked, consulting his work order. "That's me," I said, walking over to meet them. "We've received a formal complaint about a significant outbreak of Canadian thistle and Johnson grass on this property," he said, his eyes scanning my garden with a practiced gaze. "Both are on the state's noxious weed list. We're here to inspect and, if necessary, mandate immediate removal." I smiled faintly. "You won't find either of those species here," I said. "What you see are Rudbeckia hirta, Echinacea purpurea, and Schizocerium scoparium, among others, all native, non-invasive perennials." The man squinted, then walked into the garden, gently touching the leaf of a coneflower. "Well, I'll be," he said, turning to his partner. "He's right. Bill, this ain't thistle. This is a damn butterfly garden." He looked back at me, a hint of respect in his eyes. The complaint was very specific. Said the thistles were over 5 feet tall and spreading to neighboring properties. "The complaint," I said, my voice carefully neutral, "was intentionally misleading." He grunted, making a note on his clipboard. "Looks that way. Sorry to have bothered you, sir. Nice-looking garden you've got here." They got back in their truck and drove away. leaving Brenda's triumphant smirk to curdle into a scowl. A week later, it was a van from the county health department. A stern-faced inspector named Ms. Albright stood on my porch. "Sir, we've had a report of a severe rodent infestation originating from your property. The complainant mentioned seeing nests of rats in the overgrown brush of your yard." "Rats," I said, arching an eyebrow. "Ma'am, my overgrown brush is a carefully managed native ecosystem. The only rodents you'll find are the occasional field mouse, and they're far more likely to be found in my neighbors' garages, seeking shelter from the elements. But please, feel free to inspect." I led her around the property. She peered into the dense stands of grass, poked around the base of the flowers, and inspected the foundation of my house. After a thorough 20-minute search, she found nothing. No droppings, no nests, no evidence of any infestation whatsoever. The report stated that the rats were boldly running across the street in broad daylight, she said, reading from her notes with a frustrated air. "And was this report, by any chance, anonymous?" I asked. "It was," she conceded, her lips tightening. "Well, Mr. Vance, there's nothing here. I'm sorry for the intrusion. We have to follow up on these things. But this appears to have been a complete waste of our time." As she walked back to her van, I felt the cold anger solidifying into a kind of crystalline certainty. Brenda was no longer just a neighborhood bully. She was actively and repeatedly filing false reports with public agencies. She was wasting taxpayer money and the valuable time of public servants to pursue a personal vendetta. In my former life, I had a name for this vexatious litigation. It was a serious abuse of the legal and administrative process. Each false report she filed was another piece of evidence, another brick in the wall of the case I was building against her in my mind and in my ledger. She thought she was being clever, hiding behind the anonymity of the system. She didn't realize that the system itself, the very one I had helped to design and oversee for decades, was a far more powerful and unforgiving beast than she could ever imagine. And she was provoking it, over and over again. The final confrontation was precipitated by a threat so audacious, so far beyond the pale of petty HOA squabbles, that it served as the catalyst for my final strategy. It happened on a cool Saturday morning. I was trimming the edges of the stone border I'd installed when Brenda marched across her perfect lawn and stopped at the edge of my property. Her arms crossed, her face a mask of grim satisfaction. She was holding a thick, binder-clipped document, a rolled-up property survey tucked under her arm. She didn't bother with pleasantries. "I've been doing some deep digging, Vance," she announced, her voice dripping with venomous triumph. "I've spent hours at the county records office. I've been talking to my cousin, David Milcroft, on the City Planning Commission." She paused for dramatic effect, letting the name drop hang in the air. "And we found it. The solution to your little weed problem." She unrolled the survey map on the hood of her car, a pristine black sedan that was, I noted with some satisfaction, parked in violation of the HOA's rule against street parking for more than 10 minutes. She stabbed a finger at a faint, dotted line that ran directly through the middle of my front yard, bisecting the garden. "This," she declared, "is a 10-foot wide public utility easement. It was established when the subdivision was built. The electric company, the water company, the city, they all have an unrestricted right to access this strip of land at any time." A cold feeling began to creep up my spine. I knew about the easement. It was standard for any modern development. But I couldn't see her point. And I asked, my voice flat. "And," she said, her eyes gleaming with malevolent glee, The city can exercise that right whenever they deem it necessary for maintenance or safety. All it takes is a formal request from a concerned party, like a homeowners association, citing a compelling reason. She tapped the binder. This is a formal petition from the Serenity Creek HOA to the City Planning Commission. It cites your overgrown and unmanaged vegetation as a significant fire hazard and a potential obstruction to emergency utility access. It requests that the city immediately dispatch a crew to clear the easement to a dirt and gravel surface, per standard procedure. I stared at her, the enormity of her threat sinking in. She had found a loophole, a way to use the city's power to literally bulldoze a 10-foot-wide path straight through the heart of my garden, straight through the memorial to my wife. It was a scorched earth tactic, a move of such breathtaking viciousness that it left me momentarily speechless. She could legally destroy my entire life's work here, and do it under the color of law. My cousin assures me, she continued, her voice a low, triumphant purr, that with the HOA's official backing, the commission will rubber stamp the request. They'll be here with a backhoe by the end of the month. Unless, of course, you choose to be reasonable. And what does reasonable look like to you? Brenda, I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. You will rip out every last one of these weeds. You will install Kentucky bluegrass sod, per the bylaws. You will write a formal letter of apology to the board for your disruptive behavior, and you will pay all outstanding fines. You do that, and I might be persuaded to withdraw the petition. This was it, the final ultimatum, the checkmate. She stood there, radiant in her victory, convinced she had me trapped. But as I looked at her smug, hateful face, I felt no fear. The weary retiree, the grieving husband, the quiet gardener, they all receded. In their place stood Elias Vance, senior counsel, the man who had faced down corporate lawyers and hostile legislators, the man who had written the very statutes she was now trying to use against me. The switch had been flipped. The game had changed. Thank you for clarifying your position, Brenda, I said, my voice utterly devoid of emotion. You've given me a lot to think about. I told her I was going away for the weekend, to my family's old cabin on the lake, to consider my options. You do that, she sneered. The clock is ticking. She marched back to her house, victorious. She had no idea that she hadn't cornered me. She had liberated me. She had finally crossed a line so egregious that any and all constraints I had placed upon myself were now removed. My trip to the lake cabin wasn't for consideration. It was for a war council, and Brenda Millcroft had just guaranteed that she would face the full, unbridled force of a legal mind she could not possibly comprehend. The old cabin was nestled in a grove of hemlocks, overlooking the glassy surface of Lake Anna. It was my one true sanctuary, a place of worn leather armchairs, the scent of wood smoke, and decades of memories. I had deliberately left a note in my mailbox for the postman, mentioning I'd be at the Vance cabin on the lake for the weekend, knowing full well that in a community as rife with gossip as Serenity Creek, the news would get back to Brenda inside of an hour. I needed her to know where I was. I needed to bait the trap. On Saturday afternoon, a discreet black sedan, the kind that speaks of government business without shouting it, crunched up the gravel driveway. Out stepped Robert Thorne, the Attorney General, looking blessedly out of place in a fishing vest worn over his dress shirt and tie. He was carrying a leather briefcase in one hand and a bottle of 18-year-old single malt scotch in the other. Eli, he said, enveloping me in a brief, firm hug. It's good to see you. Now, tell me everything. I've got a feeling this is going to be more interesting than arguing with the Senate Finance Committee." We sat at the rustic oak table, the lake shimmering through the large picture window. I laid it all out: the bylaws, the fines, the poisoned milkweed, the slanderous newsletter, and finally, the threat of using the utility easement. I pushed my meticulously kept ledger across the table. Robert flipped through the pages, his expression shifting from amusement to professional interest, and finally, to a cold, hard anger. "My God, Eli," he said, his voice low. "This is a textbook case of harassment and abuse of corporate authority. This woman, Brenda Millcroft, she's not just a bully. She's breaking half a dozen state laws." He tapped a page in the ledger. "Filing false reports with county agencies. That's a Class 1 misdemeanor. Right there. Her threats regarding the easement could be construed as extortion. And the HOA's blanket ban on drought-resistant landscaping is in direct violation of the Commonwealth's water conservation statutes that your office helped draft." He looked up at me. "What do you want to do?" "Eli, I can have one of my deputies send her a cease and desist that will make her hair curl. We can open a formal investigation into the HOA's finances and practices. You say the word." "I have an idea," I said slowly, a plan that had been crystallizing in my mind for days, finally taking shape. But it requires a bit of theater. It was just after dusk when we saw the flicker of a flashlight beam bobbing through the trees at the edge of the property. Brenda. I knew she wouldn't be able to resist. The thought of me meeting with someone, a potential lawyer, would be too much for her curiosity and paranoia to handle. She would have to see for herself. We watched as her shadowy figure crept across the lawn, sticking to the shadows, moving with a ridiculous, exaggerated stealth. She circled the cabin, finally stopping at the large picture window, peering in. We had left the lights on inside, making ourselves a perfect diorama for her to observe. She saw me and Robert at the table, the legal ledger open between us, deep in what was clearly a serious conversation. It was exactly what she needed to see. In her mind, this confirmed her worst fears and her greatest hopes. I was plotting against her. This was the proof she needed that I was the aggressor, the troublemaker. Her hand went to her pocket, and we saw the telltale glow of a cell phone screen illuminate her face. She was making the call. 20 minutes later, the flashing red and blue lights of a sheriff's patrol car sliced through the darkness. Pulling up the driveway, Brenda emerged from the shadows, flagging the two deputies down with an air of frantic, righteous urgency. We could hear her high, shrill voice through the cabin walls. "Thank God you're here. Officers, it's him, Elias Vance. I'm his neighbor, the HOA president. He's been harassing the whole neighborhood, and now he's trespassing in this cabin with some other man. They've been in there for hours, planning something. I was worried for my safety." The two deputies, a young, earnest-looking man and an older, more seasoned officer, approached the cabin door and knocked firmly. I took a deep breath and opened it. "Good evening, officers," I said calmly. "Is there a problem?" "Sir," the older deputy began, "we've received a complaint about a possible trespassing situation." His voice trailed off as he looked past me, and his eyes fell on Robert Thorne, who had stood up and was now clearly visible in the light of the doorway. The deputy's jaw went slack. His professional, authoritative demeanor dissolved into stunned disbelief. Mr. Attorney General," he stammered, his eyes wide. "Sir, what? What are you doing here?" Brenda, who had been standing behind the officers, puffed up with self-importance, now looked utterly bewildered. "Attorney General, What are you talking about? He's just some lawyer. Robert Thorne stepped forward, a glacially calm smile on his face that did not reach his eyes. "Ma'am," he said, his voice the very definition of calm authority. "I am indeed Robert Thorne, the Attorney General for the Commonwealth of Virginia, and I am here enjoying a quiet weekend with my good friend and my former Chief Policy Advisor, Elias Vance." He then turned his gaze to the deputies. "Officers, thank you for your prompt response. However, there is no trespass. Mr. Vance owns this cabin. The only person trespassing here tonight is the complainant." He fixed his eyes on Brenda. Her face, in the flashing lights of the patrol car, had turned the color of ash. "And since you have brought these fine officers all the way out here," the Attorney General continued, his voice dropping to a dangerously quiet level, "I'd like to have a little chat. My friend Eli has been telling me about the HOA you run, Ms. Milcroft. He's detailed a rather disturbing pattern of targeted harassment, abuse of authority, and potential violations of state environmental law. Now, normally I'd delegate this to my civil division, but given your decision to trespass on private property tonight and to file what appears to be a false police report, you now have my complete and undivided attention." The young deputy was staring at Brenda, then at me, then at the Attorney General, his mind clearly struggling to process the scene. Brenda stood frozen, a silent statue of horrified realization, illuminated in the flashing lights of a justice she had summoned upon herself. The aftermath was not loud or explosive, but a quiet and systematic dismantling of Brenda Milcroft's little empire. She was charged with trespassing and filing a false police report, charges she quickly pleaded guilty to in order to avoid a public trial and further scrutiny. But that was merely the opening act. The Attorney General's office, as promised, opened a formal investigation into the Serenity Creek HOA. They dispatched state auditors who descended on the HOA's records like wolves on a flock. They uncovered years of procedural abuses, financial irregularities, and selective enforcement, all orchestrated by Brenda. The threat of a massive state lawsuit, citing violations of environmental statutes and corporate governance laws, hung over the community. Faced with legal annihilation, the HOA board convened an emergency session. Brenda resigned in disgrace. The community, finally jolted from its complacent apathy, voted to completely overhaul the association's leadership and its draconian bylaws. The covenant banning water-wise landscaping was the first to go, replaced by a new guideline, drafted with my advisory input, that actively encouraged the use of native plants. Brenda and her husband sold their house at a loss and moved away, vanishing from Serenity Creek as if they had never been. The culture of fear she had nurtured for years dissipated like morning fog. Neighbors began talking to one another again. The Hendersons next door came over one evening, a bottle of wine in hand, to apologize and ask my advice on starting a small pollinator garden of their own. My garden became a celebrated feature of the neighborhood rather than a source of conflict. It became a living classroom, a symbol of a new, more thoughtful direction for the community. I spent my days in the dirt, the honest soil a constant comfort. One perfect September afternoon, as I was tending to the milkweed, a monarch butterfly, bright orange and black, drifted down from the sky and landed delicately on a leaf. It lingered for a long moment, a silent, beautiful testament to resilience. Clara would have loved it. The war was over. The peace I had sought, a peace rooted in the rich, life-giving earth, was finally mine.